Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show, the podcast edition. Joining me now, a special guest, former ambassador, former director of national intelligence, Richard Grenell, joins us to talk about Ukraine, Russia, Iran, pretty much whatever's on his mind. Rick, thanks for coming to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
So, I mean, obviously, the big issue right now is Ukraine. I mean, this is the crisis it's at hand. Now, you were ambassador to Germany at the same time as you were acting DNI. I should mention you were ambassador there for several years, and so you have a pretty upfront, close look at how Germany sees this issue with Ukraine, and of course the conflicting interests that they might have with the United States, with France, for instance, and some of the other members of the EU. First off, what's your assessment of what's going on right now, and what role is Germany going to play in whatever happens here?
Well, I don't even know where to begin. The whole thing is such a mess. I mean, I think the answer to your question about Germany is they're not playing a very constructive role. I was just texting with some Germans who I know, and they were complaining about the fact that Germany, this current government of Olaf Scholz, who was the finance minister when I was there, and I know him, he is now in charge. He is a socialist. He's like what I like to say, he's the best socialist that we could find. I like him very much. He's a good guy and a straight shooter. What I would say, though, is that the Germans have really undercut the EU, and there's no other way to say that. They have really been a terrible EU member. The rest of the European Union, you look at the European Parliament votes, they did not want the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to go forward. And we should remember and constantly message to people that the American position, no matter what the country, including our own, is that energy should come from a diverse set of supply, so that you don't get locked into one country owning you or being able to leverage the energy against you. And what's happened in Germany is the American position is that Nord Stream 1 is part of that diversified energy source. They can include some Russian gas, just like we do. And as long as it's not too much, then you can balance it out and never be pushed or leveraged by Putin. But Nord Stream 2 goes too far, and we've been very clear for a very long time, and it's been a bipartisan clearness.
Right.
Both Democrats and Republicans have said Nord Stream 2 goes too far for Germany. What are you doing? And remember that after the Fukushima disaster, the Germans really made a quick, emotional, terrible decision, and they started to get rid of all nuclear energy. And decided that because of Fukushima, this was like an energy disaster. I think the lessons of Fukushima, we could talk a whole show on. It's probably don't build, on an ocean.
Right.
And don't build in a gully. There's a whole bunch of other lessons. Nuclear energy remains the cleanest form and something that I think we should do more of. We certainly should do more in the United States. Germany rushing to get rid of nuclear energy was a big mistake. France is not in that position. They did not make that same mistake. And so what I would say now is that Nord Stream 2 pipeline is not online. And if we wanted to solve this problem, we should just sanction the Nord Stream 2 pipeline right now. We don't have to send troops. An America First policy of bringing our troops home and not starting wars means that you let the State Department do its job and have diplomacy with muscle, which is the Nord Stream 2 sanctions. Except when Biden came in, the Biden administration and Democrats and the German government all came together to lobby against sanctions and to drop the sanctions. This is a problem that's of the Democrats, the Biden administration, and the German government's making. There's no question about that. I'll finish with this, Ed. We didn't see the Russians move on Ukraine from 2016 to 2020. Why? Because Donald Trump is unpredictable. And I heard it all the time in Europe. I just don't know what your president is going to do. And I would always smile and say, that's the whole point of foreign policy.
Well, right. I mean, this is sort of the Nixon madman theory, right? Is that you want to keep your enemies guessing. There's more to it than that, though, too. I mean, between 2016, really 2017 and 2021, there was a transformational change in energy markets. America became a net exporter of
Amazing.
oil, right?
You can't emphasize that enough. That's transformational.
And that actually undercut, well, I don't want to say undercut, it lowered energy prices around the globe, and that impacts petrostates like Russia and Iran particularly, and it leaves them with fewer options for aggression. And so when you take a look at this, you mentioned the fact that they moved on Ukraine in 2014 and then sort of solidified their position through 2015 and 2016. They could have kept going, but one has to actually look at the economic, the fiscal issue here to understand why Russia kind of consolidated their position rather than move forward. There's a pretty good sense here that they probably didn't have the resources to do it. And right now you're hearing this even around the edges, Rick, about the fact that Russia might not really have the economic resources to do a complete invasion of Ukraine, even with energy prices where they're at right now. And they're going to go higher in this kind of a crisis.
There's no question that the economy is hurting in Russia and that they need new revenue sources, which is why they maximized and prioritized Nord Stream 2. They're going to get a lot of German money. They're going to get a lot of energy money. And, from my perspective is that Joe Biden and the Washington types are trapped into this idea that every time there's a crisis, we're supposed to send U.S. troops, men and women on the ground. And that's what we're rushing to. I don't know where we went wrong, but we've shoved the State Department off. They don't get to do any, serious diplomacy. And every time we have an ambassador with muscle, they kind of mock that person and say, oh, he's undiplomatic. And it's almost like you're supposed to be this weak person if you work at the State Department. My view is that if you want to avoid war, then you better have a very strong State Department with diplomats who really know how to negotiate creatively and avoid war. Because if we fail at the State Department, if we fail in our conversations across the table, then what we do is we send that file of a crisis over to the Pentagon and they don't negotiate.
Rick, how much of this is just the U.S. foreign policy sort of going awry on Ukraine, not during just the Biden administration, but really going back to the beginning of the post-Soviet period with the Budapest agreement in '94, the Bucharest Declaration in 2008, especially, which came three months before the. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Minsk 1 and Minsk 2.
Right.
I mean, look, you're hitting on something, Ed, that has really frustrated me for a long time. And let me just tell you a tangential story which brings this to light. When when the European media kept messaging all the time, oh, Grenell is Donald Trump's man in Europe, they thought that was a negative on me, and they thought that they were taking an attack on me. But what it did is it just signaled to so many people, you should probably go through the embassy in Berlin to get to the White House if you've got a crisis or an issue. That happened over and over. I mean, I'm going to write a book someday and give all sorts of little tips of all these countries coming to Berlin to get their voices heard. But one crisis, the Serbia-Kosovo crisis, really both leaders came to me in Berlin and said, no one's paying attention to us. Can we get a little attention? And I talked to the White House and they said, yeah, explore this. Eventually, I was appointed as the presidential envoy for Kosovo-Serbia negotiations. And we launched these negotiations to do diplomatic, economic agreements. And we successfully did 4. But my point in telling you this story is that when I was appointed, the entirety, and when I tell you the entirety of Washington, D.C., think tanks, NGOs, and all those people who write white papers For 20 years, they have taken the Balkans issue and literally controlled it with their intellectual white paper and strategies. And they have failed for 20 years, but they strangled everybody in my orbit to say, don't work with Grenell. He's not coming to the NGO community. They, all of them invited me to come speak and talk about what was happening. And I just thought it was useless because if you've tried to work on an issue for 20 years and you failed, maybe we should try something new. So I came in and didn't pay attention to them, didn't pay attention to their politics, and instead went for the economic negotiations. And boom, both sides were excited. We met and we had an agreement. My point in telling you this is, if you listen to the Washington, D.C. establishment and foreign policy world, they just want to control the debate, the issues, and they cannot think outside the box. They're trapped into this thing where they talk about the crisis, they get money and jobs, and they become more powerful in their little NGOs. So you need outsiders to think creatively. The State Department, unfortunately, is filled with diplomats who are beholden to that NGO foreign policy crowd in DC.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is I'm not here to apologize for Vladimir Putin, who I think is a malevolent actor on the world stage. But I think that there has been a series of sort of this Francis Fukuyama fantasy thinking that, history ended in 1990 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that Russia was just going to become a free market paradise that would align with the West, and all of these things would just simply disappear, ignoring the reality of hundreds of years of Russian culture and Russian foreign engagement. And I am certainly of the mind that nations should be able to have self-determination in who they ally with and what their alignment is. But it's foolish to have something like the Bucharest Declaration in 2008, which just simply unilaterally declared that Ukraine and Georgia were going to become NATO states without thinking that there was going to be some response from, at that point in 2008, a pretty clearly, autocratic Vladimir Putin.
Look, we could do a whole show on what you just asked. Very smart analysis, and also, I think, a frustrating point in Washington, D.C. when you look at these issues. But look, no one has been tougher on Putin or Russia than me. I mean, you look at my tenure even in Germany, and we were very strong standing against the Russians, pushing the Germans to do more. But I don't believe that diplomats should be just poking Putin in the eye every turn. Yeah. And I also think, let me just say this, it's going to be controversial, but I don't think that we should be talking about adding NATO members when the current members aren't paying their fair share. Why are we going to extend this agreement to protect other countries in this, in this NATO alliance and a NATO agreement? Why are we going to extend that umbrella if the current members are undercutting NATO? Now, I will go to my grave arguing that what Donald Trump did was try to strengthen NATO. He did not ignore the problems that NATO has seemed to have because, because it's just been adrift, right? So many presidents have ignored the problems of NATO, people not paying their obligations, old way of thinking, not being able to take on today's challenges. And when Trump came in and just said, NATO is acting irrelevant and nobody's paying attention to it, he wanted people to pay their fair share so that we could strengthen NATO. And of course, what did the Europeans do? They attacked him as saying, oh, don't get us off this status quo that we're on because we get to not pay our bills and America is paying for our security. I mean, you can't blame the Germans. And I've been in those meetings where Donald Trump looked at Chancellor Merkel and said, I don't blame you, actually. I don't blame you for taking advantage of the United States. Why wouldn't you want to have a budget surplus, not pay your NATO bill, have 50,000 American troops, and never have to worry about an invasion from Russia or somebody else? Because we are protecting you. But then Trump would say, but you can't blame me for working for the American people and demanding that stop. And that's what I loved about President Trump, is that he was challenging the status quo when all of Washington and Brussels, Berlin and Paris love the status quo.
Yeah. So let's turn our attention. We got a few minutes left, and I don't want it to keep you too long. I know you're a busy man, and I want to get back to what you're doing these days too at the end of this. But let's talk just at least briefly about what your assessment is of the Joe Biden foreign policy as expressed through the State Department and Antony Blinken. I mean, what's your assessment of Blinken's performance? What's your assessment of foreign policy at the moment? You're already kind of clear about where you see it on Ukraine. Just in generally, though, I mean, where are we headed?
Yeah. Well, look, we have to be honest when we take a step back and we say that the leadership, the political leadership of the State Department right now is a Obama third term. And there's no question about that. It's the same players. Yep. Remember that Antony Blinken was Susan Rice's deputy at the NSC. And Avril Haines, who is running the intelligence agency, she's the director of national intelligence. She also was Susan Rice's deputy. And so Susan Rice, who couldn't get confirmed, and people think that she's a disaster, she couldn't get confirmed as Secretary of State, and so they couldn't go with her. And so she is now running domestic policy from inside the White House. Nobody believes she's actually running domestic policy. Everybody knows she's running international and foreign policy. And I think the rumors are true that Biden really wanted to pick her as the VP, but Barack Obama said, no, you need somebody with legislative experience and somebody who's got a better name like Kamala. And so what I would say is that we have been trapped into this Obama third term. Remember, the Russians grabbed Crimea and redid the borders of Europe under Obama. Right. Brexit started under Obama. The European Union was really smaller and less effective after 8 years of Barack Obama and Joe Biden. There's no question about that. And I don't understand why the foreign policy establishment, especially in Brussels, doesn't see that Europe is less secure, weaker under the Democrats in Washington, D.C. That's just looking at the facts. So I don't like the way the State Department is right now. I think it's been shoved aside. Antony Blinken is so weak that even Joe Biden is kind of saying, we can't go with any of his ideas. You just saw Macron host the French and the Germans, and the Russians and the Ukrainians are talking about a solution for Ukraine, not including the Americans. Now we see the French going to Russia, then going to Kiev. I just think that it's obvious that the State Department under Antony Blinken and Wendy Sherman is incredibly weak. Remember now, Wendy Sherman gave us a disastrous deal in North Korea. She got outsmarted by the North Koreans. Then she gave us a disastrous agreement with Iran. Then she was brought in to do negotiations on Russia, failed there. I don't understand why we keep putting these weak diplomats at the State Department under Democrats. I will say that they like this idea of consensus with the Europeans, where we all just agree. And that has become the lowest common denominator of foreign policy. I saw it after 8 years of my tenure inside the UN Security Council, where 15 members water down something and they all have to sign off. And the agreement that you look at or the statement is so weak, it's not effective. And that's what they maximize. That's what they want at the State Department. Joe Biden wants to be loved and applauded by the Europeans. So the Europeans are watering down the US policy. I think that the opposite of America first is consensus with the Europeans or the UN, and it just means that we are not in the lead. I now believe that the Democrats want that for America. They want to see us as one of many, as just a partner with the rest of the world, not standing out and leading. They somehow are ashamed when America has to be alone or be the leader and step out first. They want, they keep talking about, we're together. I mean, yesterday between the new Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Joe Biden at the White House, it was just a kumbaya. We're going to act together. We're going to act together. We're going to be together. that it's such a lie. No one is paying attention. And why didn't Joe Biden look at Olaf Scholz and say, Chancellor Merkel didn't pay her NATO bill. Are you going to? Are you going to pay the 2% obligation? You got 50,000 American troops there. You got a budget surplus. What's going on? I mean, that's diplomacy. That avoids war. But instead of confronting them with diplomatic language, we're sending U.S. troops into Ukraine. And I'll finish with this, Ed, because it's really made me angry. After the disastrous Afghanistan debacle,
right,
where Joe Biden was very proud to have left 10% behind. He said, we got 90% of the people out. And he was really proud of that. The world saw that as a moment where they couldn't count on America. And they were questioning that. Look, the Biden administration took the Houthis off the terrorist list. The Houthis are now bombing the UAE. Abu Dhabi has been receiving missiles. Good thing they have the ability to stop those. Otherwise, we'd see all out war. But this is the weakness that keeps coming down the pipe. And I'm very concerned in Ukraine that the reaction from Afghanistan, the disastrous pullout, meant that the Biden team and the Blinken State Department has once again used emotion over facts in Ukraine. We pulled out everyone from our embassy. We were the first ones. We're usually the last ones.
Right.
We vacated our embassy, and the rest of the world said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to follow the United States. We don't think that a war is around the corner. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government is saying, stop with this war talk. It's typical of this emotional politicization of foreign policy by the Biden team. And now the irony is that the media and the Democrats keep saying that the Trump administration did that. And they are totally doing that. How else can you explain being the first to vacate in Kiev, our embassy, when no one followed us? I think that they were so afraid of what happened in Afghanistan that they used emotion over intelligence and facts and just immediately vacated. It's a terrible, terrible conundrum.
Yep, absolutely. Now, I know we're out of time. I want to give you a moment. If you've got any projects going on, you got anything interesting going on, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing these days?
Well, thank you. I've got a whole bunch of friends who are running for public office. And so I'm trying to help them where I can. I do my political work for my friends. I don't get paid. I always want to say that. I'm helping my friend Adam Laxalt in Nevada. I'm not getting paid on that campaign. I'm working hard to just help where I can. Jim Layman in Arizona is another person that I believe. Jim Layman is in a crowded primary in Arizona, but he's been able to get all of the national security and border immigration experts. He's got Chad Wolf, Mark Morgan, Tom Homan, Brandon Judd, all of those and myself and Matt Whitaker have all endorsed Jim Layman. And I think that's one of the untold stories, is that in Arizona, immigration is a very big deal. And all of the people that are the experts on immigration, border security, national security, public security have endorsed Jim Layman in that Senate race.
All right. Well, we're going to keep an eye on Jim Layman. Excuse me. And we're going to keep an eye on Ambassador Rick Grenell. Rick, thank you so much for being with us today. Great talking to you again.
Let's do it again soon, Ed. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show, podcast edition. Joining me now is one of my good pals, one of my good friends, both from Relevant Radio and this show, Peter Grandich from petergrandich.com. Wrote the book Confessions of a Former Wall Street Whiz Kid and is still giving testimony to the Christian way of doing business at petergrandich.com. And he's here with us right now, of course. Peter, great talking to you again.
Great to be with you as always, Ed. Very much appreciate it.
We'll start off with the jobs report. Now, we're recording this on Friday afternoon. So this is just a few hours after this jobs report dropped. I've been reading jobs reports for well over a decade on a consistent basis, right? And doing analysis on this. And I know that every year the Bureau of Labor Statistics does these sort of methodology adjustments because, these are surveys. These surveys have to be in relation to the population so you can do the correct projections. I don't think I've ever seen anything like the adjustments that took place in this jobs reports. I mean, the numbers are just wildly changing in this adjustment. You've got something like in a month, 1.3 million people added, or 1.4 million people added to the workforce in a single month. From December to January, you had 467,000 jobs added. That was on the establishment survey, which is a little bit more stable. But I mean, this is crazy. You see all these pluses, and yet the participation rates, the two different participation rates, didn't budge. Something's really odd with this thing. It doesn't add up internally.
Well, for starters, people got excited when they said, "Oh, look, the last 2 months were bumped up, like you said, 1 million something." But what they didn't cover in the media, if you go back to earlier in 2021, they did away with 600,000 jobs that they had reported and brought that down. I think more important, first of all, let me just say this, and I'm emphatic in this. I will trust ADP, who doesn't really have an axe to grind one way or another other than getting what they believe is the count correct, versus government workers, no matter what party's in charge. I'm not saying it's just, I think it's been going on for years. It's been used. If you can imagine, some of the whispers going into this was there could be as much as 1 million jobs lost because of Omicron. In fact, the press secretary, Biden's press secretary, was working for days in her conferences trying to prepare people for a soft, employment number, about how much Omicron was going to impact it. And then this came out. And I just think ADP, who had shown a significant loss in jobs, was more reliable. But as you said, there were other things that you can count on more that just don't add up. And then what little coverage there's been so far is the big bump up in wage costs.
Yeah.
I think that should be the headline story, because not only do we know that we have a supply shortage, a not transitory. This is something that isn't going to be fixed by having a few meetings and getting a few more boats into port and so forth. This is a real serious problem. Everybody I know throughout different industries, different types of businesses, are not only talking about labor problems, but abilities to get parts and services, and then one impacts another and it goes down the line. And on top of that, we now have wage costs going up. And we saw Clorox and others talk about the cost, and they're going to have to pass it on, and they're going to raise prices. And the other tricky thing that's going on is they're actually shrinking the boxes. They actually made, some people nameless, made the box bigger, but the package actually inside is actually 1 or 2 ounces shorter and all.
Right.
So these are all the things that make us be very suspicious. And I suspect in the next couple of months, if both you and I are still above ground, we'll be talking about how they readjusted this number a few months down the road.
Well, I expect it next month, actually. And that's the reason why I say, let's take a look and see what happens after all. Now that they've made these adjustments, let's see what happens next month, because I suspect that there's going to be a big adjustment back. I mean, it's not just for January either. I mean, they upwardly revised December and November, which is normal. They usually do revisions to the previous 2 months, but these are upward revisions that added something like 700,000 jobs. I mean, these are massive revisions based on this new methodology that they're adopting. So yeah, I mean, it's odd. Now ADP, I think I'm a little less sanguine about ADP, because I've tracked ADP for several years too, as you have as well. And ADP is usually aspirationally a leading indicator of what the BLS is going to do. Rarely is it usually gets the trends right. And this is, I think, your point, is that the trend here from ADP was 301,000 to the negative. Now, I don't know that that was a great guess, but I certainly expected today's number to be under zero as a result. I don't think I've ever seen them miss in that far in, and while getting the direction entirely wrong. I mean, we're talking about a miss of close to 800,000 here.
I think I've been at this, I'm going to be going in my 39th year, and of course, I don't remember every month, but if there was a bigger percentage miss, I don't remember it. It might have been, but I would say this would have to be in the top 3 in the last 4 decades. And what was real interesting, and of course, we knew Biden would come out and say something, prepared as usual, that, it's a good thing. And then, of course, wouldn't take any questions, because I can imagine the questions that would have came about the figuring of this. And he has trouble understanding the simplest thing now, to try to explain the new methodology or whatever and how these numbers came about would have been a lost cause. So I didn't expect that. I clearly knew he wasn't going to answer any questions on that.
Yeah, clearly. Getting back to the wage thing, because I think you're right. This is, I think, the bigger news. Because, again, I don't know that you can rely on any of these numbers. I'm not sure how good ADP's numbers are. I'm very sure that this Bureau of Labor Statistics report really doesn't add up. I'm just going to say, let's do a mulligan. Let's not make any assumptions off this and see what happens in February. But the wage gain issue is, I think, separate from that. And, you saw wages go up. I think it was like 23 cents an hour. The annualized increase now is 5.7%. You've got inflation now up to 7%. And this looks to me like the beginning, and it has for a month or two now, the beginning of a wage price spiral, that where this is sort of like what they call chasing the dragon with addicts, right? Is that, businesses are going to start increasing wages in order to compensate for inflation. But as you add labor costs from all these wage increases, it forces prices up. And this is the wage price spiral that we saw in the mid to late 1970s. Do you see the same risk? And even better yet, Peter, because you have your eye on the markets at all times, are corporations starting to price this risk in as well?
The answer is yes and yes, and especially the last part. Corporations who were struggling to pass on costs for several years have jumped all over this. I mean, everybody, both in the public sector that you can see, but even the private people that I talk to in businesses around the country, not just in my Eastern Seaboard type of, have all talked about how costs have gone up. Talk to anybody who has restaurants, what food costs and how they have to pass that on in the menu. We're seeing tremendous supply shortage. Let's make no mistake about it. We were, just as we were told a year ago, inflation itself was transitory and not to worry about it. It wasn't too many months ago we were told that the supply issue is just because of the lockdown, with everybody coming back now and all, it'll all be great. Yet more and more people are seeing stores empty shelves, or products and services they're so used to being told it'll be many months before they get it. I've talked to several people who have been building and can't complete buildings because there's certain parts that they just can't get, that normally they would get in days or weeks, and now taking a month of being told possibly a year or longer. So I think that is going to be the bigger story as this evolves. But one thing it does do, the negative on this, if you want to look at it as a negative, is the Fed can't play the game of making the assumption we are that, it's not real and it's going to be lower. They've already been put in the corner. There's no question they're going to raise rates because they're already viewed behind the 8 ball. Now the big surprise in Europe, how Europe came out of left field and suddenly jacked up rates when many people thought they weren't going to do that. Once all that kicks in, it just kind of feeds on itself. And I told you many months ago, both on your show and perhaps when you were filling in Relevant Radio, I know I've shared with Drew and others, that I said last year the bigger negative is going to be the bond market. Because you see, when the stock market can go down, Ed, but you could have a company or an industry that does well and it could still go up. But trust me, when interest rates go up, bonds go down. End of story. There's no exception to it. And you remember we had a conversation when I talked to you and we shared that for the first time ever, junk bond yields went below the consumer price index, and that was before it rose.
Right.
So those purchases back then, people are already looking at a double-digit loss on a fixed income. You see, when I was in the financial advisory game and the people that are still doing it, when you got tired or concerned about the stock market, you moved to the fixed income market because you got a return, and the return was always normally just ahead of inflation, so the people didn't get hurt. Now, what's going to happen? The Fed says it's going to step out of the bond market and it's not going to make it purchases. Well, they've been 50, 60, sometimes 70% of the purchases. Inflation's somewhere between 5 and 10%. Anybody tells you anything different, it's just not right. It's just across the board.
Right.
Well, if something is 2%, which government bonds basically are now, and inflation's 5 and 10%, and you take the Fed out of buying that 2% paper, I don't know who's going to pay that paper. Now, they pay it if it goes to 5 or 6. So I still think as concerned as one should be about the stock market, and I think we've seen the bubble burst. You know, you and I and several others have talked about it, the world's biggest financial bubble of all time. I think the air is coming out. It's clear. We're watching some of the most favorite stocks that just a year ago, if you listen to certain networks and all, that sound like you just couldn't miss. And now they're down 30, 50, 70% from their highs. But the bond market to have double-digit losses, and here's the most people that suffer from that are the least that can afford it. They tend to be the elderly, the retired, the conservative. And Ed, the second phase is coming that you and I talked about, I think the last time you and I spoke. And that is these people also went into dividend-paying stocks.
Yep.
In order to make up for where they couldn't get yield elsewhere. And I've told you the story that here in this 55 and over community, people say to me, Pete, I don't care if my stock's going down 30%. Besides, I'm leaving it for my kids. Just don't cut the dividend because that's how I live off of. That's the next unfortunate negative that's coming. As the economy does slow, as things get tougher, as rates rise, we're going to see some significant dividend cuts. The dividend cut in AT&T was no surprise, and I suspect we're going to see that in other places. And that's where the real trouble is going to hit. The combination of the bond market with interest rates going up and inability to keep paying dividends at the levels that they paid it at are really going to set us up for, I think we'll be talking more and more about that as we get through this year.
Well, I think we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. And one of the things that we're going to talk about, and I think you and I discussed this on Relevant Radio, not on the podcast here. I know I've talked about it with another friend of mine, King Banyan, who's the professor of economics at St. Cloud State University, is the flexibility that the Fed actually has, or the limited flexibility it actually has. You know, when Paul Volcker came in and jacked up interest rates, to 20% in order to wring out the wage price spiral, in order to wring out the stagflation that was afflicting the economy in the late 1970s. First off, it took a while because nobody had done anything for a while with this. But the other thing is that the Fed's books were relatively light at the time, and national debt wasn't anywhere near. I mean, it was in a completely different minor league than where we're at right now. So, the Fed's going to raise interest rates. They're going to cut back on their purchases, but they don't really have the flexibility to simply get rid of all of the quantitative easing purchases that they've made over the last 10 or 12 years, Peter. It would be impossible for them to devolve that, right?
Well, that definitely would have a huge implication if they wanted to sell them. Now, they're talking about just letting them so-called run out, that they don't make any purchases, and as they mature, they don't reinvest that capital and so forth. And that would be enough, but they would really have to start selling that to really bring the balance sheet down. But you bring up a very good point. When Volcker did that, we were the world's largest creditor nation, and our true deficit was under $1 trillion.
Right.
Now it's 30. We went over 30 trillion the other day. And we go back to this story, and it's very simple math. We have 30 trillion in hard debt. It doesn't take into account what the government owes for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There isn't any cash sitting somewhere where we draw from there and we pay those people. But we'll move that possibly up to $70 trillion of additional debt over here, like the government does, because they don't fund unfunded liabilities like you and I as a business owner would have to. But even at just the $30 trillion, if interest rates just go to 5%, and you have to refinance at 5%. That means we would be paying $1.5 trillion of interest expense.
Yep.
Ed, in our best year in 2019, the government took a little about 3.2 trillion in tax revenue total. We would almost pay half of everything we could take in taxes to interest.
Yep.
It's a non-starter. And then if you want to start talking about 6, 7, or 8% interest rate, you're like, so you're right. They don't have the maneuverability that Volcker had. And we don't have the support that we had. I can't tell you, and this is your area of expertise, the political will among our so-called allies back then to now is nil. We're certainly in a battle to still be the number one economic power. That wasn't the case back in 1980. We certainly had less issues, I think, here. We certainly are far more divided as a country now than we were in 1980. And so the other issue that I have, and I hope it never comes to this, Ed, and that is when we had the last financial crisis, which was really a crisis created by investment bankers for selling people mortgages that they could never afford in the first place and sold it short to them so they profited twice. Those same people are still around, by the way. The government at least was able to go in a room and they came up with this quantitative easing, which if you remember when Bernanke sold it to us, it was just going to be one time and most of the money was going to go to infrastructure.
Right.
That's how things were going to turn around, which it never did. Okay, then we got QE2 and 3 and possibly 4 as well. I don't think we have the political will anymore. Could you imagine the Democrats and Republicans suddenly Monday having to go in a room and try to work out some financial crisis? I don't. It's sad, but I can't see it possible.
I don't see it either unless it was on the order of a complete meltdown. At which point you might find some consensus to do some short-term stuff, just like they did in 2008, right? I mean, the Bernanke thing was a short-term near consensus at the Fed to basically allow Congress, or to give Congress room to do some short-term stuff. So it's short-term. And because Congress wasn't going to commit to doing long-term restructuring of the nation's finances, or of the unfunded liabilities that are coming due in all of the different entitlement programs, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, food programs, all of that there's tremendous unfunded liabilities in all of these entitlement programs. And they won't even budget the other part of the federal budget. They won't even, I'm trying to think, the discretionary spending part of the federal budget runs over revenues too, right? I mean, there's no discipline at all. And so there was a series of short-term things that got them past the one crisis. If you had a similar level crisis, Peter, I think you'd find just enough consensus to do some of those kick the can down the road type of things, leaving all of the structural problems in place. I'm not even sure that we ever had the consensus to fix all those things back in the early 1980s or late 1970s. Again, I think it took the Fed to take action. Congress wasn't going to do it. And that was when Congress was dominated by Democrats.
Yeah, like I said, there are a whole host of things to be concerned about economically, socially, and politically, and don't paint a great picture. I personally believe, and this is just, I'm a man of 65, going to be 66 soon. I believe we've seen the best of bull markets. I don't believe there'll be anything close to what we've had, whatever my natural life is left, whether it's 1 year, 10, or 20. That's how long I think. And what really sad is that our children, and if one has grandchildren, will pay even a bigger price, because it's going to be much tougher for far longer for them than it will be for me in my latter stage of my natural life.
So with that in mind, and because we always bring you back to the markets, you're a market guy, and I know that we're going to talk about this in general terms because you don't do specific recommendations. Even when people call into the show on Relevant Radio, on Drew's show, you don't do specific recommendations because you're a very conscientious man, and if you're going to give advice, you need to know everything that there is to know about one of your clients before you can tailor any advice to this, but in general terms, if you're looking at the market now, where do you go to try to navigate the extremely rough waters that are going to be coming ahead here very soon?
Well, it's a story I've been singing for perhaps as long as I at least know you, Ed, if not longer, and that is less is more. That has been my philosophy, despite the tremendous blessings from the Lord in material things. My wife and I have shrunk a size on how we live and what we do, and we've dedicated over half of our work to be given away. But I think people's lives should be less is more. I've stated that. I dealt with athletes, and that was, you want to talk about an impossible task, is to tell some young 25-year-old kid that just signed a $20 million contract not to buy the $5 or $10 million home and the $200,000 car and all of that. And the line I always used to get, yeah, but the guys I play with have that. And if I don't do that, but for the average person out there, spend less than you make. Now, that's hard because there's this philosophy, and it's been here for decades, of keeping up with the Joneses, as we used to like to say it, and to live the lifestyle. But realistically, the other problem that we're having now, and this guy did it when a few elections ago, when he talked about there are more and more people in the wagon and less people pulling the wagon. And eventually those of us left pulling the wagon, which means the weight of paying the taxes, because they want to do away with paying back student loans. All the answers here are going to be raise taxes. That's all the government really has at its disposal. Less service and raise taxes. Those are the two main things it can do. There's going to come a time when people pull in the wagon and go, listen, I'm tired of pulling. I want to get in the wagon too. Some that are extremely wealthy can escape it. But the middle class and the upper middle class, so to speak, are the people that are going to be hit. And those people are the ones now who are, finding ways to protect as much as they can from this. And that's why even you're seeing certain people of wealth moving out of certain states to other states. I mean, the difference of being in New York City and making $1 million and living in some place in Florida could be 6 figures saved in taxes. That's a huge difference to make somebody say, you know what, maybe I'll put up with the heat for 10 or 11 months instead of just 3 or 4. And that's why there's a big demographic shift going on too. And it's not discussed, but if you look how people are moving, you moved recently. I'm not saying that's the reason you moved, but there's probably more movement of people, especially people of older age and some means, to certain areas for reasons economically, socially, and politically. And it really changes the demographics to when we looked at 20 or 30 years ago. And I think those are things people have to take into consideration, irregardless of where you think the stock market's going up or down, and all these other things now that come into play that our parents and our grandparents never had to worry about.
I moved for a couple of reasons. I mean, actually several reasons. There's health reasons that we moved and some other things too. But among them, I got to say, Peter, was your advice. Get rid of as much debt as you can. Get yourself into cash positions. Get ready to write out some of this stuff from the strongest position possible. And of course, I'm just like everybody else. I'm getting older. Like my father likes to say, there ain't no one getting younger. So, you got to plan for that too. But I mean, the debt issue, I think, we've talked about it quite a bit. And I really began to see that wisdom. And that was part of the reason, for our move, was to get to a position where we could lever the assets that we already had and get to that position where we no longer had to worry about, ongoing structural debt in our finances. And we're there. So I feel much better about going forward with this. But I think that there may be a lot more people who are following that advice that you've been giving out for a while, Peter.
Yeah, and where it really came from, Ed, when I decided almost 20 years ago that I'm not going to depend on some Wall Street written book, but on the good book, the Holy Bible. The interesting thing is, even if you want to look at the Bible not as a religious book, but as a book of just that a lot of people have claimed success over, as most people run out and buy a book because somebody just said, hey, you should listen to this person. The author or authors of it don't have one positive thing to say about that. In fact, it's probably one of the biggest discussions. You know, people don't realize, I know we may run out of time, but I think this is important.
Yep.
Matters of finance are talked about more than heaven and hell and praying. So God, or whoever you want to say was the author or authors of that book, really must have felt it was going to play an important part. And one of the things it really speaks hard against when it comes to matters of finance is debt. It also talks about the responsibility you have that if you've taken it on to pay it back as well. But so that was what led me. And then when I looked at all the ill things that I saw people doing by getting leveraged, it made me want to come debt free and always urge people to be debt free. And there is, and I bet you'll say this in all honesty, there's a sense of peace and restfulness that you have, that if you can remember the times when you were more leveraged, even though you might have been doing well at the moment, but if something went wrong, the whole thing could go out of whack. That peace now that I hear from people, they tell me is worth everything.
Yep. No, I completely agree with that. At least in that area of my life, Peter, I have some peace. And yeah, it's the peace of the Lord. I firmly believe that. And I really appreciate all of the conversations that we've had that led me to sort of that enlightenment. And it really is something that I don't think I would have thought too much about if it hadn't been for our friendship. So God bless you and thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.
Well, again, I think it's one of the reasons why, this course changed in my life and what I wrote about, because, I was once very much into money as my God, that whole story and all in it. And your story, I hear over and over again from people now that have heard. And then what, of course, I also hear from people is, boy, I wish I had listened to you. I didn't. And now here's the problem I have. And by then it's too late. It's, they have to go through a very tough period of time.
Indeed. Well, that's about, we're just about out of time here, Peter, but I want you to tell people where they can find you. And also about your book and how they can read your book, because that's also a great story.
Well, Confessions of a Former Wall Street Whiz Kid is on my website, petergrandich.com. You can read for free. It's also at Amazon if you want to order the book. Basically, I'm down to posting on my blog at petergrandich.com, and I do YouTube videos from time to time, and I do select interviews with gentlemen like yourself. And that's pretty what's left of my life. And but it is still a calling, and I think now more than ever, I tell people is the book that you need to read is not even Peter Grandich's book or some guy on Wall Street or TV, but the good book that the Lord left us. I believe it's a manual to life, and it certainly is a manual when it comes to matters of finance.
Peter Grandich, petergrandich.com. Go there. Listen to him on the Drew Mariani Show on relevantradio.com as well. You can listen to it on the air or off the app. It's great either way. And of course, petergrandich.com. He's got all the different YouTubes of his thoughts and advice. So be sure to check that out. Stay tuned for more from the Ed Morrissey Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show. Joining us as always on Tuesday podcasts is the Prince of Twitter, the Regent of RedState, Andrew Malcolm at AH Malcolm on Twitter. The man with 1,000 nicknames. After 13 years on my show, he's got 1,000 nicknames. Andrew, great having you back on.
It's good to be back on. My life would be so screwed up if it wasn't Tuesday with Ed. I mean, yeah. I just the whole week is built around that.
Oh, same here.
Yeah. So when you're traveling or something, then it's just an empty period in my life, Ed.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but the good news is I'm not going to be traveling. Wow, this took a somber turn real fast right out of the gate. All right, Andrew. Speaking of somber, nothing somber about your one of your columns this week. We're going to get to both columns. First, though, I want to talk about what happened at CNN last week. We're kind of, as of Monday afternoon here, sort of in stasis from the developments that, on Friday probably is the latest news on this. But CNN, Jeff Zucker got the boot. We're still not clear as to exactly what Chris Cuomo was going to say about Jeff Zucker, but whatever it was bad enough that Warner Media kicked him out. Alison Gullis, though, the woman that he was having an affair with and whom he promoted while having a sexual affair, apparently that stretches back a couple of decades, is still at CNN despite basically lying about the nature of the relationship in her public statement, saying, oh, that changed during COVID. And then you had a number of people who went public and said, no, it didn't. This has been going on for years and years and years. You have to look at this and ask, how does CNN hang on to Gullis? How do they defend their credibility after everything that we've learned over the last few days that's been going on over at CNN?
It is kind of a sad saga in recent years, I must say. After, I forgot his name. Oh, Peter Arnett and
Yep.
all the crowd in the early years over in the war areas.
Well, Bernard Shaw too as an anchor. I mean, these guys were about hard news.
He was the newsman on WIND in Chicago when I was in college there, and he did the hourly news on the radio. So it's kind of sad, and the market has a way of sorting these things out, and it appears, given their ratings, that it is, and people have gone somewhere else, although there are always going to be people who stick with them. In fairness, the woman, if the real reason for Zucker to go was that he didn't disclose the relationship early on, if that's the real reason, then she didn't have to. So she didn't commit the crime that Zucker did. So
yeah, and I've mentioned this, right? I've mentioned that the fact that usually the junior partner in these types of things is usually treated differently. I mean, usually, and this is true in all different kinds of organizations, because to some extent there's a question as to whether or not they are themselves victims of manipulation, the power differential and all that. And
although the fact that she jumped to CNN to follow him eliminates the idea of coercion. Once he left NBC, she was free, but she chose to follow.
It's interesting too. Yeah, you're correct about that. And you had Katie Couric, who was saying that there was something going on between them at NBC. There's been other sources now that are saying the same thing. So this is stretching back, at least a decade or more. And because this was in 2008, 2009 at NBC. And in 2013, you had Roland Martin and Soledad O'Brien, who both left CNN during 2013, who came out immediately afterward and said, Alison Gullis' explanation is false. We all knew that there was something going on between them. And I think that you're correct to a certain extent. This is more about human resources than it is about media.
Yeah.
But this does actually relate to media credibility, because here you have a CNN executive who went out of her way to issue a statement that appears to be blatantly false. And I mean, that's got to be a problem, right?
Yeah, it does. But, these institutions, the Catholic Church is one of them, and modern media is another, are run by humans. And we all have, not me and not you, but we all have human failings.
Oh, I've got them in spades, Andrew. No, never doubt that.
All right. Well, then it's just me. That's
just
perfect.
You.
Yeah. It wouldn't be so bad if they weren't hypocritical.
Right.
They'd be all over a politician. Remember, they were all over Elliot Spitzer. Boy, was that a fun story, huh?
Yep.
What was it? Client number 9. They were all over him, and they're here at the same time. They're doing the same thing, except maybe money wasn't exchanged. It's just kind of tawdry, but you're right. The important part of it is not, oh, we got you, Jeff Zucker, but the important part is that there's another media institution whose credibility has just been shattered.
Well,
And
right.
we
I mean,
we need these institutions. You know, I mean,
I
I've
agree.
said a lot of, you and I have both, and Bernard Goldberg and others have said a lot of bad things about them because we want them to be better. But we really, really need them. And we need them to be strong and financially viable to do what their proper role should be. They're not doing it now, and I don't know if they can earn that credibility back. It's a very serious situation. And I don't know how it's going to be fixed, honestly.
well, I mean, I think it has to be fixed by having other media outlets treated honestly. And this was the Associated Press's business section today addressing this. And this is the lead paragraph for this story. For all the potential peril of a workplace romance, the most common source of trouble, experts say, is allowing it to remain a secret. I mean, yes, part of this is the workplace romance angle on this. But if you're a media outlet looking at what happened with Jeff Zucker, Allison Gollust, Andrew Cuomo, and Chris Cuomo, the secret workplace romance is really a secondary or tertiary issue. You had Zucker and Gollust turning CNN into Andrew Cuomo's propaganda channel. To me, I mean, if I'm another media outlet looking at this, I'm not really looking at hearts and flowers here. I'm looking at how you corrupted an entire news organization, at least in part through this personal, sexual relationship connection.
Yeah, that's right. I've been in a couple of news organizations, and they didn't have these kind of blatant things that I knew of. But they did have human foibles in which there were sacred cows that you couldn't say anything bad about. And there were certain people who were guaranteed to get a story out of doing nothing compared to other people who had to earn their shot at getting into the newspaper. I mean, editors who had favorite subjects, and if you had a story on that, you could propose it to them and you knew it would go well. And other editors who had sensitivities that would shoot it down, not on its merits, but because of their own personal proclivities. That went on all the time, to my knowledge. And that's before the media had their big credibility crisis. I was in newspapers, major metropolitan dailies, before I think they had all these modern troubles. There were hypocrisies then, but not the sort of ones that get caught now because we have the internet.
Right. Well, not the kind of conflicts of interest that we're seeing here too. And you're right, not as much accountability. I mean, until Bernie Goldberg really stepped up, all the accountability was internal. And, there was sort of like this omerta going on within these media outlets, that thou shalt not speak ill of the editorial process sort of thing going on. I'm looking at this Associated Press business review of what happened at CNN. And, I'm not even sure that the name Andrew Cuomo even comes up in this piece. I mean, that's how, talk about omerta, right? I mean, this is almost a distraction strategy, right? It's almost like if you're complaining about this, you must be an enemy of love. Are we enemies of love, Andrew? Is that what's going on here?
That's right. And Valentine's is coming, so that makes it timely. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, this is a reason why people don't trust media, right? You got CNN, whose executives are lying about this stuff, propagandizing for a favored Democratic politician, and the Associated Press, which is at least to some extent a competitor of CNN, deciding that they're going to tackle the deep issue of nookie in the workplace rather than the actual corruption of the news process.
Nookie in the workplace. There's a clickable head. Nookie in the workplace. That's a good one. Well, and you talk about human foibles. Associated Press is a co-op, so CNN is a member.
Oh, that's true. So they're not actually competitors. They're actually collaborators in the non-judgmental sense. There's collaborators and there's collaborators, but that's
they're
true.
Part owners. I mean, the CNN is, quote, an owner of AP, like all the other news organizations that are members, and so they're cutting some corners there.
Yep, indeed. Well, we're going to continue to watch that situation to see what gets reported and what doesn't get reported. Allison Gullis is still working there. I'm surprised. I did get a hint in one report that she's working there, but it isn't going to last long because when Discovery comes in and takes over, they're probably going to give her the boot. But for right now, they're just not going to rock the boat. They're going to leave her in place and maybe eliminate her position. That's something to watch in the eventual merger. But my guess is that they're going to try to downplay this, right?
Yeah, they'll downplay it and wait for some of the winds to blow over, and then they'll come in and new management teams. See, that was, I mean, if you want to take this into politics, that was Trump's mistake when he took over, was not canning Comey immediately. He could have canned Comey as a new president. Immediately, and there would have been no question about it. Or if there was any question, it would have gone away very quickly. But he waited, endorsed them, and then canned them. And then you've got a problem with the media that Comey knew how to play.
Yeah, I think it would probably still have been an issue, even if he'd canned him right up front, because before Trump even took office, the whole Russia collusion thing was exploding in the news. So I suspect it wouldn't have made a ton of difference, but the timing there made it worse for sure. There's no doubt about that. All right. So speaking of love in the news, I got to ask you about this column that you wrote over at RedState.com. Cialis, when the moment is right, while China violates human rights. Now, I am as adamantly opposed to watching even a moment of this Olympics on live television for as long as it lasts. And by the way, the ratings apparently are just terrible on this. I have a piece coming up a little later on Monday that shows that ratings for both the opening ceremonies and the first day of competition are off 43% from a similar period 4 years ago. But your piece, I think, goes right to the heart of the whole business model here, right? Which is what happens to the endorsers, what happens to the advertisers on NBC's broadcasts, especially once they see these ratings. It's going to be terrible.
I had a poll. Yeah. Oh, I had a poll, a morning consult. It does some really interesting stuff that you don't expect. It's not just the horse race polls. They do a lot of stuff like this, in which they ask people, what should advertisers do given the human rights predicament in China, and the fact that they've paid a lot of money to reach a lot of people. And a lot of people came and said they should not sponsor the Olympics.
Yeah.
I think it was a majority. And others said, well, they should issue a statement, which, neither one of them is going to happen. Because there's so much money involved. NBC said they sold most of the ads, but they have to, I don't know what they call it, givebacks or whatever, because the ratings are so low, they'll have to give some of the money back, or give them commercial time on other programs that are better rated.
Right.
But NBC paid, what was it, $7.5 billion.
Yep.
For the Olympic rights through 2032. That's a lot of money. They also invest a lot of money to do this. They've got I think 1,000 people over there, technicians and people. Most of them you never see. But to make things run on time, and guys who edit the videotape of the of the slalom run, and it's a huge operation. One of my sons was involved in that on a newspaper point of view some years ago. But first of all, you've got the International Olympic Committee, which is, to my eyes, a kind of shady operation. And they're picking places like China. That these are locales that bid to get the spot. So it's not really, well, who can we help NBC with? China had the Olympics 2008, I think it was.
Right. Yep.
And then Korea had the last Winter Olympics. But when you get to Asia, that's a lot of that stuff is happening on another day, and people want to see it live. I mean, ABC, Wide World of Sports, and you're there, and you can see things, and it's very exciting. There is a delay of several seconds that nobody knows about, but the audiences were huge, and assuming that not everyone went to the bathroom for the commercials, you have a lucrative market for corporations like Coca-Cola and others to Procter and Gamble to sell to. You gather a crowd and you want to make money off them. None of that bothers me. But when the Olympic Committee, which is the one that made the mistake, picks China, that has a communist country that is an autocracy basically of the party, then you create a problem. But it's not the Olympics problem. They still got the $7.5 billion from NBC, and I'm not sure they care until 2032 about the ratings. And the ratings will come back. They'll come back. So I don't know where the next ones are, but
Los Angeles is 2028, right? I believe Los Angeles is 2028. It's either 2024 or 2028. I know Los Angeles it won one of those, so that'll solve a lot of the timing issues for the American audience. But
my favorite story about the Olympics and the committee was, they met in Copenhagen to pick the summer games. When Obama was president, Michelle Obama was there leading the American delegation to sell them on Chicago.
I remember that. Yeah.
And she called her husband and said, if you come over here, I think we can pull this off. So he took Air Force One at $250,000 an hour, and he flew to Copenhagen, and he made an impassioned appeal after his wife did for Chicago to be picked. And while the two of them were on the plane over the Atlantic coming back, the committee eliminated Chicago as a possible place. Now, there were reasons, because it all had to be spread all over. It wasn't just in one place.
Right.
And Chicago, or Obama was so pissed, I understand, when the next Olympics happened in Vancouver, he refused to go, and he sent Biden.
I recall that too. Yes,
yeah,
he was. He was angry.
Our neighbor country, and you're going to snub them. But that's we get back to the human nature of these institutions. That's Obama too, and he's a vindictive. He can be a vindictive person, but that's how you survive in Chicago politics.
Right.
I had a friend who was a member of the city council. He was a maverick member of the Chicago Democratic City Council. And I said, boy, that's got to be a tough life, because they screwed him over, he was a lawyer, and whenever his clients would come to his office, the police would tow his cars, or they'd put tickets on them. And so they had to find special places, but all kinds of harassment, because he was a pain in the butt for the mayor of Chicago. So I said, boy, Marty, how do you handle all this stuff? And he says, it's just politics. But hey, Andy, I've started working out. I started running, but I quit it because you can't knock anybody down. Politics in Chicago can be a contact sport. And actually, Biden picked him to do something on some committee in Washington. So he's still in the fold, even though he annoyed the Chicago machine. But the Olympics, it's all about money.
It's all about money. That money's coming to Los Angeles in 2028. Just to close the loop on that, it is 2028 when Los Angeles gets it, and so some of that'll probably correct itself. But right now, I mean, there just isn't. I think that your column, which actually came out a few days ago, is going to turn out to be prescient. I think a lot of these advertisers are going to start demanding to claw back their either claw back their investments or get Super Bowl advertising, because NBC has the Super Bowl, which is going to be right in the middle of the Olympics this time. So that might end up saving some of NBC's bacon this year on this.
And there's some advertisers that have staying out of the Super Bowl this time. I think Subway and Coke and others, I think, are staying out now. They don't have the problem of human rights with the Super Bowl. But it's, and the time difference. I mean, I think that's a killer. I mean, who besides Shaun White, who does anybody care about in the Olympics? If you've got a kid in your family, it's big news. But and NBC, to their credit, said they're going to carry every minute of the Olympics on Peacock in one form or another after. I guess they screwed things up in the Summer Olympics, which I also happen to miss.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, I mean, I'm talking about the Olympics and NBC's terrible decision to broadcast this. I know a lot of people are boycotting it. I'm not one of them. I just never watched the Olympics anyway, so I'm just continuing with my policy of not paying any attention to the Olympics. And so consider it a passive boycott. I'm just not going out of my way to interrupt my heavily scheduled avoidance of Olympic matters, large and small.
Will you be watching the Super Bowl without Pittsburgh?
I will be watching the Super Bowl. I've actually been watching more football this year. I took almost the entire year off except for that Super Bowl last year. And the only reason I watched the Super Bowl last year is because Brady was in it. I thought, wow, that's really fascinating, because I didn't expect him to ever get back there. And that was a good Super Bowl. I really enjoyed it. But Pittsburgh didn't make it, unfortunately. But Los Angeles Rams versus Cincinnati Bengals, I'm okay with that. I wouldn't have picked those two teams to make it.
And I pointed out on Twitter, those are two Ohio teams. The history of that. The Rams started in Cleveland.
That's right.
And they have the first of several cities that the Rams abandoned: Cleveland, St. Louis. They left Cleveland in 1946, which made room for Paul Brown to come in with a team named for him. They played in the All-America Conference for 4 years, won the championship every year against another team called the Buffalo Bills. 1950. Ed, I'm sorry, you said the word Pittsburgh. I can say that.
No.
1950, the first year in the NFL. How long did the Jets have to wait? 6-7 years for the AFC or the AFL to win the championship.
Yep.
1950, on the first season as an NFL team, the Cleveland Browns won the championship against the Los Angeles Rams on a last-second field goal. It's sweet, and they did it. They then went on to win 4 championships, but then after 64, they haven't won any. And then Super Bowl started in 67?
67. Yeah, they haven't been to the Super Bowl. They're only one of 2 original NFL teams that haven't been to the Super Bowl, and we all know who the second one is, right?
No.
The Detroit Lions.
Oh, right. Yeah. Oh, that's bad. That's bad company.
That's very bad company.
Cincinnati was in. Of course, they lost to Joe Montana, but so, and I like Joe Burrow, I have to say. I forgot the end of the story. Paul Brown got fired by Art Modell, the bad guy, in 1962, I think it was. So he went to Cincinnati and founded the Bengals with the same colors as the Browns. In your face. So I kind of like the idea of, and Joe Burrow is to all accounts a really nice guy, and he's good. So I think I'll be rooting for them.
See, this is what happens when you mention Cleveland on with
Yeah, this is
Andrew.
much everybody gets treated to some ancient history.
Well, we got a couple of minutes. I know I'm going to tell people to go read your VIP column at RedState.com on typical Biden. If Putin invades Ukraine, he vows sanctions that don't work. Go read that. But before we go there, I'm actually going to talk a couple of minutes about a different story. Have you been following what happened with Chris Wallace and his move to CNN? Because I think this is a separate story. Chris Wallace dumps Fox News to do CNN Plus, which is a subscription service that relies on the idea that people are going to pay to get more CNN. On the basis of Jeff Zucker running it.
They get it drummed into their heads in so many airports.
I guess, but
and they pay for that. Did you know that CNN pays the airports to play them?
Yep. Yeah. I'd heard that before too. So Chris Wallace dumps Fox News, and he had a prime perch at Fox News. Now I know that he was unhappy with some of the direction that the editorial guys were going in, the primetime guys were going in. Ends up at CNN with Jeff Zucker, and now reportedly is irate that Warner Media has booted Jeff Zucker because Jeff Zucker was the reason he came over there.
It sucks to do that.
Yeah, I mean, in what universe was that?
He doesn't have a show yet. He's kind of high and dry, but he's a star, so whoever's gonna, was it Discovery? They're gonna work out something for him.
I would think.
For him to do, but it sure won't be Sunday morning prime time.
No, I mean, Dana Bash has that pretty well locked up on CNN, and I think Tapper does some of that, but not all of it. Alaput had a good suggestion, which is to restructure their prime time around hard news and put Chris Wallace in on prime time, which I think would actually be a smart move. But
yeah,
I don't
program.
Counter program, right? I mean, you and I mean, just for another minute here, you and I have seen this. I don't understand why nobody at CNN or Warner Media has seen this. They have a perfect opportunity to counter program against the ideological content in prime time by simply going hard news. Bring in hard news guys who are known for being hard news, turn them into the new Bernard Shaws and sort of Wolf Blitzers. I mean, they still have Wolf. He does earlier in the day, but why not? I mean, why haven't they? I mean, is it just all Zucker that's been in the way of doing that?
I don't have any great insights there, but the idea was that in the Trump era, opinion trumped everything, so they got good ratings during the Trump era by basically counter programming Trump, but he's gone basically for them. So You're right. That would be a good move. I don't know who Discovery is going to prop up in there, but I imagine there will be some significant changes, and they'll have to come up with a new philosophy. That's just too much money to let go away, dribble away.
Yep. All right, so we're at the end of our podcast episode, but we can't let you go without the traditional jokes of the week, Andrew.
Well, I got some. They're what I call replays. They're older ones. The Jimmy Fallon replay. He says, as Super Bowl champs, the Giants, who just beat the Patriots, will meet President Obama at the White House. Meanwhile, the Patriots will meet Newt Gingrich at Waffle House. And Conan, who's got a thing about Boston, he says, heartbreaking loss for the New England Patriots to the New York Giants. Remember that was Eli Manning and
the helmet catch. Yeah.
Heartbreaking loss. Boston people haven't been this angry and depressed since every other day of their lives. finally, this one is this is Jay. I mean, I always liked Jay Leno.
Yep.
You remember when he was? I did a couple of programs with him, so full disclosure. But they were going to cut his staff, and so he took a pay cut. I think he was getting $30 million a year, and he gave half of it to back to NBC to keep his whole staff on until the end of his run. So anyway, he said, tonight's our last show after 22 years. So much has happened in that time, but the saddest part is OJ never really found the real killers.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note,
wait a minute. One other.
One more.
David Letterman. He says the Sochi Olympic Hotel for the Russian Winter Olympics, I think, is called the Two Seasons. Instead of a little chocolate on your pillow, Russian maids leave a potato.
Not to mention a microphone.
That's right. That's right. That too.
I was gonna say a bug, but it would have come out sounding a little weird with the potato thing. Right. So yeah. All right, Andrew Malcolm, of course, he is the prince of Twitter at AH Malcolm on Twitter. He's also the regent of RedState, redstate.com. I'm sticking with that, man. That's great.
Yeah,
Regent of RedState. Really
it sounds like it. Yeah. It's showbiz.
It's showbiz. It's all showbiz. Andrew Malcolm, of course, thanks so much for being here.